Hello, I'm Cameron Archibald and you're watching The Full Scottish. Today I'm joined by Kirstein Rummery, who is a Professor of Social Policy at Stirling University, and also joined by Kathleen Nutt, a journalist at The National. Today we'll be discussing multiple different topics: women in the public sphere, Brexit and independence, which never seems to go away, and also finally the main topic of media in general. So, hope you enjoy this show and let's get started. So let's kick off the main show with the first topic, women in public sphere in general. First of all, we had news today, with Nicola Sturgeon praising this announcement actually, that the Church of Scotland has a new moderator, Reverend Susan Brown, who is the fourth female to take that role in history. So we'll start with yourself. What do you? How do you take this? Is it quite a big progressive step forward for the Church of Scotland?
It is a progressive step forward, but I think it's also a sign that the Church of Scotland is probably coming more into line with kind of social and public opinion generally. I think it would be seen to be kind of behind the curve not to make that kind of appointment. And certainly iconic appointments like that are really important in terms of giving mentoring and giving, showing women taking public office and taking power. But when you look behind the scenes at the numbers of women who are actually in powerful positions in the institutions like the church, like parliament, like law, then you see that we still got a very long way to go before we have parity with men.
Kathleen, when it comes to the religion in general, do you think we're making enough progress with kind of a more liberal view within the church or within religion in general? Do you think there's much more progression to still be achieved overall?
I'm not sure actually. Susan Brown's obviously the fourth female moderator of the Church of Scotland, which is good, but there have been other female, there have been three others, so I don't think that's necessarily an indication that we're becoming a bit more progressive. Certainly, the Church of Scotland has got a history of being a bit more progressive in that sense, but at the same time, I don't know if the Church really reflects society in itself. I think there's a report today that the Church of Scotland may only last another 30 years, so I don't know how representative the Church is of wider society.
Why do you think that is then, with the Church of Scotland only lasting over 30 years? Is that lack of interest? Is it outdated values?
Well, I suppose a lot of people don't believe in religion anymore, don't have any particular faith, and which is not not a bad thing, just we are as a society moving away from religion as a practice.
So the point was made there that religion does not reflect society. So could you make the argument that whilst there's small progression going on for the Church of Scotland, in the wider public sphere there is greater representation of women, or again is there still a long way to go?
I think there is still quite a long way to go. I mean, if you look at my sector, if you look at the higher education sector, we've got roughly 50-50 women at lecturer level, but then when you go up professor level it becomes sort of 15%, and then if you look at the people who are actually running universities, it's very, very rare to see a female face. And exactly the same is in places like Parliament. So we've actually going backwards on women's representation in the Scottish Parliament. We had a high of 33% and we're back down. Certainly when you look at kind of worldwide sort of parliaments and seeing women in, not just in Parliament, but actually in positions of power in Parliament, it's still very skewed. The historic leader in terms of women's representation in Parliament is Rwanda, with 60% of women who are parliamentarians. But that was as a result of a very brutal, bloody civil war, which basically wiped out the male political class. And that's not really the kind of thing that we want to see to kind of engender more women being participating. But it does indicate that you actually need quite a big transformational change in society. And all of the kind of institutions where we would see women's leadership, it has stalled. And unless big exogenous things are done in order to push it forward, it doesn't actually progress naturally. And it's not to do with the quality of women who want to stand for public office or the quality of women who are working there. It's really to do with kind of the way in which the structures operate against women's interests.
Okay, so let's talk about the structures as you talk about, or in general the blockades which a lot of women face when going up the ladder in a career.
Yes.
What are those barricades? What are the factors when it comes to the glass ceiling overall?
Well, in my own industry, it's probably the area that I know most about. Again, men are very much in prominent positions, despite the fact that probably there are more women who go into journalism than men. But I don't think there's one single title, main title anyway, edited by a woman in Scotland at the moment. And if you look at my own area of politics, I'm probably the only female political correspondent in Scotland. I go along to press conferences, I cover Holyrood, and quite often I'm the only woman at a press conference. I must say, actually, that's now different. There are, the Sun has got a female political journalist, and so has the Daily Mail. But generally speaking, I think there's probably about maybe 2 or 3 women political journalists, political reporters, that is, out of perhaps maybe 30. And I'm frequently at press conferences where I am the only woman.
So why is that the case then, generally speaking? Is it just, are they...
Well, from a journalist point of view, I think it's probably, political journalism is a key area people want to go into. People enjoy it, it's an interesting issue. And I think there's probably quite a lot of male aggression in terms of getting that job. And women perhaps aren't naturally as aggressive in terms of seeking job opportunities. It is also a job where you are expected to work long hours and perhaps be on the ball 24 hours a day to a certain extent. So maybe women think, well, I don't want to do that, I've got other things in my life. And but also I think there's probably a lack of encouragement from senior editors and senior people in newspapers to encourage more women into that area, and saying, looking at talent and saying, actually that's a so-and-so a really talented journalist, why don't you think about going into politics? So I think they need more positive encouragement.
And Kirsten, how would you add on to that? Would you say there's also maybe a social aspect to it as well, why women are facing a glass ceiling?
Well, it is a glass ceiling. What we're seeing is what I would call occupational segregation, both vertically and horizontally. So in fields like journalism, in fields like public sphere, lots and lots of companies, you've got a concentration of men at the top. And men being overrepresented at the top means that they kind of structure the company or structure the industry in the way that reflects their interests.
So is it almost like a patriarchy in a structural sense, or?
It is almost like a patriarchy, and that and you don't need to go very far to see evidence of it being a patriarchy. Men are very much overrepresented at the top, and women are underrepresented at the top, and women are overrepresented in the bottom tiers. But you also see, and it's interesting you brought up the example of journalism, a sort of occupational segregation in that there are loads and loads of very good women journalists, but they'll be on lifestyles, and they'll be on fashion, and they'll be on the softer areas. And that isn't to say that those don't sell newspapers. People are very, very interested in those areas, probably more interested than they are in sport, to be honest. But those women will be earning less, they'll be working in less high-profile areas, and it's also the kind of value that we accord to women's work, so that you get people who are, again, going back to the journalism example, women working in fashion will be paid less than sports journalists and things like that. We've very recently got massive, massive scandals at mainstream broadcasters around equality of pay. People doing exactly the same kind of job, China correspondent versus other correspondents, and the men being paid twice as much as the woman was. And when you actually look at the actual nature of the job, there's no rational reason for that. What is actually going on is the overvaluation of things that men do and the undervaluation of things that women do. And I would say that you can overcome this. I mean, certainly in my sector, we do overcome a lot of it with mentoring, with senior women actually taking responsibility for bringing up junior women and training them and getting them involved in the networks, which are the way that you get forward. But that's still working within a very patriarchal institution. It's not actually changing the very structures that are causing the problem in the first place. It's just getting women to adapt to them better. And I think if we're actually going to see long-term change in this, we actually have to really bite the bullet and address the structures themselves.
Well, let's actually discuss the solutions we can do to that. I am Stirling University like yourself. I was studying social issues around how we can encourage more kind of 50-50 balance when it comes to the workforce and careers in general. One of the solutions which I had to study was the idea of PR, proportional representation within, for example, politics, because that works to help present candidates much better.
Yes.
And it works very well in a lot of Nordic countries. So Do any of you want to kind of develop that? Why is that the case?
Okay, if we look at the electoral system that we have at Westminster, not in Scotland, but at Westminster, we have a first past the post system. This means that every vote that isn't cast for the winning candidate is a completely wasted vote. So there's a lack of engagement of people generally in politics because they really don't see the point unless they're going to vote for the winning candidate. It also means that we have an inbuilt preference for the incumbent. So the person who has already won an election will be most likely to be put up again. And we know statistically that that's going to be more likely to be a man than a woman. So it's very, very hard for women to break in through party structures and actually get to the position where they're actually being selected and put forward. We do know historically, not just in the Nordic countries, but any country that's had a new kind of constitutional settlement. So we saw it a lot in post-Soviet Russia, the breakup of Soviet Russia, the establishment of new democracies, Latvia, Lithuania, places like that, where you actually had a new kind of parliamentary system, and it was based always on some form of proportional representation. None of them chose to go first past the post. First past the post was very good in about 1700 when you wanted to know who clearly was the party in charge. It's completely not working for current democratic purposes. The other thing that moving to proportional representation does is that it does bring in, as I said, new people into the system. It disempowers the power of incumbency. And so there's a lot of argument about, well, we don't want to do things like, all women shortlists or anything like that because people should be there on merit. But that's a disingenuous argument because often what that is doing is just simply supporting the status quo and having a very strange idea of what merit is. Merit means somebody who's already in post. It discounts, well, merit might be somebody who's got actually experience outside politics. Merit could be somebody who actually represents more of what the electorate has actually experienced. People who've experienced poverty, people who've experienced job insecurity, people who've experienced working or needing to rely on the social care system. These people are all disproportionately not represented in politics. And if you had a proportional representation system, you would change the political parties and the way in which political candidates came forward, but you would also crucially change the nature of Parliament. Because what you would actually get towards is it would be very difficult for one party to gain an overall majority. And in order to push forward policies, you'd have to have consensus building. You'd have to have cross-party consensus on particular issues. We know, for example, we don't even have to go to the Nordic countries. We can look at the difference between the Scottish Parliament and Westminster Parliament to know that actually that consensus building around key issues leads to a much more open, cooperative, democratic style of policy making. And that lets not just more women through, but it lets more working class people through, it lets poorer people through, lets people from ethnic minorities through. It takes away the incumbent privilege from that white middle class male who's probably gone to public school and probably gone to an elite university. It's not sufficient on its own, but it's a very, very powerful lever to see political change.
You said we shouldn't don't just compare Scotland with Norway, we compare Scotland with Westminster, but let's compare Scotland with Norway because, as you said before, Scotland still has a long way to go to actually, represent women. In fact, we've actually gone back from, was it 2003 that was our peak?
Our peak was in 2003, yes.
So why is it that PR, especially in Scotland, seems to not work to full potential, but in other countries it does?
I would say that you have to look at the wider social context of what's happening in there. And what we actually have in Scotland is still a very unequal society on gendered basis generally. So we've got a disproportionate number of men going to elite institutions. We haven't got systematic things like childcare or things like that they have in the Nordic countries. And the key reason that does differentiate the Nordic countries from neoliberal countries such as Scotland and also other countries as well which have tried to do these things is that they have gender equality embedded into their institution, embedded into the constitutional framework of how these institutions are meant to work. So every bit of policy is scrutinised to see whether or not it's going to have a disproportionately negative impact on women. We have nothing like that in Scotland, we have nothing like that in the UK. And it would be that would make the most significant change.
We're going to move on now to a new, next discussion, which is going to be Brexit, Northern Ireland, and Scotland in general. The idea of independence. This is going to be a long discussion, so we'll kick off with the main news. Scottish Parliament voted to not give consent to the withdrawal bill by a large proportion, about 90 to 33 or 93 to 30. Now, interestingly enough, Adam Tompkins, the Tory MSP, he made the point before that the Brexit bill would not go ahead without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, but David Mundell confirmed after the vote that they would anyway. So where does this leave us then, Kathleen?
Well, certainly I believe there has been a power grab. I think that is quite clear that that's happening, that the devolution settlement has been overturned. I thought it was incredibly a bad call of David Mundell to speak out in the way that he did just a few minutes after the vote. So the vote was on Tuesday, and as you say, it was the consent was withheld by 93 votes to 30, and very powerfully Bruce Crawford stood up at the end of the vote, at the end of the debate, I think, and said, in fact, after the vote, and said, well, asked the presiding officer to write to Westminster to make clear how the Scottish Parliament had voted, and that the Scottish Parliament had voted to withhold consent. So he made a big, very dramatic speech to that effect. And I thought, oh, it's going to be a while then before there'll be a decision from the UK government, and maybe wait a few days, wait for this letter, and pop up, a few minutes later after the vote, after Bruce Crawford's very passionate speech, and David Mundell was saying, yes, we're just going to press ahead. And I thought, oh my goodness, well, first of all, bad media management, I thought personally, but also just the fact that he just, on a whim, decided that they were not going to, the UK government wasn't going to listen to what Scotland did. And okay, people on the streets may not be talking about the power grab, perhaps it has become a little bit, maybe some people may say it's too technical, that's the way it's being pushed by many in the media at the moment. But I think it feeds into the wider picture of well, Scotland's voice isn't being listened to. Scotland voted to remain in the EU. The Scottish Government wanted to be involved in the negotiations with Europe over what sort of deal we'll get, over withdrawal terms, and again it wasn't ignored. So I think in this whole context, there's a sort of picture building up where Scotland's not being listened to, and I think it's no surprise that we are seeing tens of thousands of people on the streets marching for independence.
There were some arguments for the general theme of this power grab, saying, well, okay, perhaps Westminster are going to hold these powers for a while, but since 2014 we actually had a stream of new powers coming into the Scottish Parliament. So surely you could say that that makes up for this power grab. Would you make that argument?
I wouldn't, because I'm an academic and I look at the evidence of what's happened in the past, and what we've seen very, very clearly in terms of the political structures and the way in which they respond to things like this. If we compare, for example, the 2014 Scottish referendum on independence with the Brexit referendum, and the minute the result came in on the independence referendum, we were promised, Scotland was promised additional powers. Yes. But the very first bit of legislation that went through was English votes for English laws. And it was very much a refocusing back to the centre, a refocusing back to the needs of the Westminster Parliament. And historically, my political science colleagues will agree with me because they badgered me about this. Every time I look slightly vaguely kind of hopeful that we will actually see meaningful devolution. Historically, Britain is very centrist in terms of its politicisation. Even with devolution, there's still an awful lot of power, and it centralises back to Westminster. And the example of Adam Tompkins and David Mundell having completely different perspectives on what should be happening from the same political party is an absolutely key classic example of this. Now, within Scotland, we have quite a good, a much more kind of open system of governance, as I was saying before, but we've also got more of a balance between the parties. We don't have, although the SNP is the majority party, it doesn't have an open majority. So there is a sense of the Scottish Parliament itself actually wanting to actually have powers, and that's even held, even the Tories that voted against the withdrawal bill are still quite in favour of that kind of local, more what they see as a more localised level of governance. But that is in stark contrast to their party colleagues in Westminster. Westminster wants it all centralised back. And some of the arguments that get put forward are very strange. If you look at kind of Tory philosophy, it should be about removing some of the power from the state and actually empowering citizens, empowering the market, etc. So this idea that we have a centralised power grab that resides in London is actually sorry, pardon my language.
It's fine.
It's against the political nature of the Tory party.
Yes.
And I think what we've seen throughout Brexit is the political arguments are irrelevant, that this is actually about ideology, it's about appeasing the right wing, it's about all sorts of other things other than a sort of comprehensive idea of where we're going, what we might want to do to get there. All of that is completely missing from Brexit today.
Well, we could argue, or we could maybe predict that Ruth Davidson has herself said that her Scottish MPs would vote as a bloc to defend Scotland's position. So, do you think that Tory MPs could actually vote against the Brexit bill in order to, or at least threaten it, in order to try and loosen this power grab?
Not at all. I mean, they've already said that they're not going to do that in a sense by voting for the EU withdrawal bill in Holyrood, and the MPs. I mean, we've got some of the most passionate, those Brexiteers among the Scottish MPs, people like Rose Thompson and Stephen Kerr and Alistair Jack, Colin Clark, all being very much supporters of Jacob Rees-Mogg, who not only want a more centralised UK, but actually don't want any relationship with the EU, want have very reluctantly agreed to an implementation period, and now look set to perhaps agree some sort of form of customs union, although it probably won't be called that, it'll be fudged, I'd imagine, but I can't see Tory MPs voting in any way against the EU withdrawal bill in Westminster.
We've spoken about the Conservatives now, but let's move on to Scottish Labour and Labour in general. So we know Scottish Labour, they backed the Scottish Government with the Lib Dems and the Scottish Greens to not give consent to this power grab, as they've claimed. But we also have Jeremy Corbyn backing Scottish Labour in the move. But we also have Welsh Labour who disagree with the Scottish Government and saying actually this is a fair deal, and they got the backing from the Scottish Conservatives and UKIP within the Welsh Parliament. So this is clear, there's a very big disagreement there.
It's an interesting issue. I think as Brexit Minister Mike Russell has pointed out numerous times, Wales and Scotland are very different countries in terms of how they voted in the EU referendum. Wales voted to leave. Obviously, Scotland voted significantly to remain. So there is a different political setup. There's also the issue of UKIP having a very strong presence, or a relatively strong presence in the Welsh Assembly, whereas obviously there's no UKIP MSPs. So perhaps Labour was coming in under some pressure as well from UKIPers to back Brexit and back a bill to withdraw the UK out of the EU. So that's one aspect, but also I think there's more at stake in the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament has got more powers than the Welsh Assembly, and I think that, I'm not an expert on this, but I think the Welsh Assembly has a different type of devolved settlement than the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament has everything that is not reserved is devolved, whereas it's a different model in Wales. So I think there's a very different situation between, I don't think there's parallels between Scotland and Wales in terms of Brexit by any means, or in terms of the devolved arguments, which I think Labour at one point were trying to make out that there was, but I think that was probably a bit of a misstep from Labour just shortly after in Scotland in terms of a misstep. I mean, Leslie Laird, the shadow Scottish Secretary, I think the day of the agreement being announced between Wales and the UK government was that why doesn't Scotland get on and do a deal? And I just thought, that's a curious position to come from, and I think it probably wasn't wise. I think if Scottish Labour had gone down that line, they again would have been seen to be propping up the Tories, and obviously that didn't do well for them in the past.
Let's talk about Labour specifically. Kirsten, with maybe Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn has been criticised for not uniting his party quite a lot, and this could be seen as another example of Jeremy Corbyn again, not managing to unite his own politicians. Is it just a case that Scottish Labour and Welsh Labour disagree because the devolved settlement is different, or is this another example of Jeremy Corbyn just not able to run his party?
I think it's not really the case that the devolution settlement is driving what Labour is doing. I think when you look at Brexit and you look at the Labour Party, the Brexit vote didn't run along party lines. It ran along regional lines and it ran along class lines. So you've got right-wing support for Brexit, but you've also got very left-wing support for Brexit. And the political parties are really struggling, all of them are really struggling to respond to this, because the Tories have got a right wing that are in favour of Brexit and a centrist wing that are against Brexit. Labour is exactly the same. Labour responds to that in terms of quite fragmented notions of what Brexit could mean, what it should mean, etc. And in Jeremy Corbyn, they have a leader who's very charismatic, has very much appealed to the young vote, brought momentum out historically in terms of grassroots campaigning, and has revitalised the Labour movement. But at the same time, he's not a politician that has extensive experience of leading a political party, and particularly leading a political party through substantive political change and constitutional change. And this emerges very, very obviously when you look at the fragmentation between Labour in Scotland and England and Wales. It also emerges when you see the fragmentation between different wings of the Labour Party, and it's no longer the case that it's simply kind of pro-New Labour and anti-New Labour. There are really sharp divisions within the Labour Party itself, that he is a leader. I mean, I don't know if it would be in the capacity of any leader of the Labour Party at the moment to create some kind of coherent political party, but particularly when you see the response to the local council elections. I mean, historically, people vote very differently in local council elections than they do in general elections, and they vote very differently than they do to the referendum. So drawing parallels just simply like that doesn't really, really work. But historically, when a ruling party is in power and is deeply unpopular with certain sections of society, which the Tories certainly are, then you see a resurgence in local councils for the opposition party. And we saw some growth of the Labour movement in the local councils, but not nearly as much as you would be expecting under those circumstances.
Finally, on the point of Brexit, one point as well that right now in Stormont, there's still no real devolved government there. In fact, it's direct rule from Westminster. So do you want to bring some light onto the situation there? Like, what's happened over there? Why is there no agreement?
Well, I think there's no agreement because the two main parties, Sinn Féin and DUP, can't agree on the way forward for example, the Irish language. And the Irish language shouldn't be politicised, but maybe has become politicised in Northern Ireland, and the DUP is saying that an Irish Language Act would give more of a greater role to Republicans, and so I think that seems to be stalled on this issue. But it's hugely important that the devolved assembly gets back up, because Northern Ireland has been voted again to remain, and yet has had no input into the negotiations over of its future. Fortunately, Ireland has been a key player in the EU negotiations, and has basically said there will be no hard border. I think if Ireland hadn't been able to play that role, I think Northern Ireland would be pretty much scuppered. But Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, seems to be, I suppose, campaigning for quite well on behalf of people in Northern Ireland at the moment, in the absence of a devolved assembly. We're
going to move on to our third and final main subject. This one's on broadcasting. You may have heard the other day that STV were going to let go of 59 jobs. That also includes, kicking out STV2. And we had Ponsonby and Mackay walking out when they heard that announcement. There's been a lot of controversy around these decisions. So, what does this mean for the future of STV? Is this a sign that maybe mainstream journalism is shrinking slightly?
Well, I think it's certainly a devastating blow, not only for the journalists involved, 59 journalists who are going to be losing their jobs, but I think it's not good news for the Scottish public. I think it's in our interest as a public that we have a vibrant news media, that there's a strong independent broadcaster, especially now when so much is happening in the country and the world, and with Brexit, possibility of a second independence referendum, and of course all the new devolved powers that the Scottish Parliament's getting over welfare, over income tax. So it's a time when we should be having a stronger media, not a weaker media, so we can inform, so media can inform the public, but also hold power to account. So it is very worrying times, and I hope we're not going to be seeing an even weaker broadcasting sector as a result. Obviously, we've got the new BBC Scotland channel being launched next year, so maybe that's some grounds for hope. But at the same time, I think the budget has come under criticism. They're only going to get £30 million a year, whereas in the Scottish Broadcasting Commission the recommendation was for £80 million a year. So there's maybe some concern that it might not be as good as it ought to be.
Well, we're going to come back to the new channel in a bit, but there's one other point which is quite important. And Aidan Kerr, who used to work at STV, highlighted this point actually. That the CEO wasn't very loud about this, but the CEO was actually increasing dividends for STV shareholders by 18%, whereas they're making cuts of up to £1 million each year. So, what are we seeing here then? Why is it the case that when we're seeing such massive cuts, shareholders are getting an increase of 18% in dividends?
It is very worrying. I'm not a specialist in broadcasting particularly, but as a citizen I find it incredibly concerning. We've always known that the broadcast media, mainstream media, is a market. It's a business. It's there to make money. And the BBC is always held up as being, that sort of independent voice that is taxpayer funded, or funded through different means. And it's always been incredibly important to have that variation in voices. But when you treat a business as primarily about driving profit, rather than actually doing the business that is in the business to do, then you see all sorts of skews in the way in which the organisation operates, and you see a lack of accountability to what we might see as consumers kind of thing, the people who are actually consuming the thing, which in this case is broadcasting. You see in other areas as well. You see in private finance initiatives where people are kind of working to build hospitals, and actually instead of money going on frontline care, it's going on dividends that go back towards kind of land and capital taxes and actually pay off shareholders more. And I don't want to go back to Brexit because we're talking about Brexit a lot, but the whole idea behind this opening up of the markets and not actually having strong regulation from Europe is going to have a massive impact in these kinds of areas as well, so that you actually can see there is a role for the state to play, and there should be a role for the state to play in terms of mitigating against that kind of thing. But you can't have the state playing that kind of role when it's independent broadcasters and independent media.
There's an argument to be had as well that some people will argue, well, actually the reason SCV are having to make these cuts is because, the quality of journalism has dropped and people just aren't giving that much attention. But then there's the flip side to that, saying, well, actually the reason mainstream media, journalism might have actually dropped in quality is because cuts in the first place. Others might argue, actually it's not actually dropping. The quality is still there. It's just the voice is a little quieter. So how would you see what's the balance there?
Well, I think there have been enormous cuts to the Scottish media over the past 10 years, certainly in newspapers, and then of course that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If newspapers and broadcasting have fewer resources, they can't do as much as they can with the resources they have, so the product becomes less strong. So yeah, I think it's a very worrying time. I think newspaper editors and broadcasting chiefs need to invest in journalism in order to produce quality products.
You also brought up as well the new BBC channel that was coming in.
Yes.
You made the point that SBC 10 years ago made the point that to start this new channel they'd require 80 million.
Yes.
If you actually update that figure with inflation, it's actually 103 million now,
Yes.
and they're only getting 30 million. Some have argued that this is a case where actually this isn't going to work. Pat Kane
Yes.
came out and said that actually there's very little hope for this. Some have argued that actually this is just going to starve a new BBC channel and it's going to be a waste of money. But what do we think here? Is it going to be a waste of money, or do you think this is an opportunity to actually have a good news channel?
Well, it is worrying because if it hasn't got the proper resources, it could be set up to fail. So that is a concern. But at the same time, it's £13 million which is being put into the economy, so we don't want to just completely write it off at the start. But I think it needs to be good in order to be able to continue. So
I think there is a gap. There is a huge gap because the thing that we're not really talking about is the way in which kind of new forms of media have actually competed, and people are getting news from a whole massive range of sources now, online, social media, and things like that. And we talk about fake news, and we talk about this kind of thing, and there is a real gap for authenticated, proper, old-fashioned journalism in terms of people that will hold power to account, will go behind the scenes, will do the investigative work, will not just pick up bits of stats from the internet and rehash them as news and this kind of rolling thing. But that's an incredibly important role, social role, and political with a small p role that broadcast media needs to play. I would rather see 30 million than none. And if it is that, as a citizen, I would like to see it really, really focused on what we might call high-quality, old-fashioned journalism, investigative journalism, because there's all sorts of stuff on. We can get all sorts of information from all around the world, but we still need to have that core thing that is looking, particularly in Scotland, looking at issues that are pertaining to Scotland with an absolute quality control hat on. Proper mainstream media that is not biased, and that is. Both sides get accused of being biased, and they get accused relatively equally from both sides, so they kind of tend to be getting it right in terms of quality broadcasting. So you take more players out, and you take journalists out, and you take particularly the mainstream old-fashioned investigative journalism out, then you've got a real problem in terms of authenticity at the broadcasting centre.
Well, we talk about authenticity in general for mainstream media, and you also have the rise as well for fake news, as is the more popular phrase. And a lot of people we see go to news sources which kind of just reinforce their opinion. So, for example, I write commonly for a wee blog which gives political news from a certain perspective based on what happens on the news. But we see from the blog I write for, we seem to get a certain audience. So how do we? You talk about supporting investigative. My pronunciation there is more mild. You're supporting, investigating journalism, and we also have as well. How do we pull people out from the bubble they're stuck in for reinforcing their views?
My discipline here.
You can absolutely go for it.
Because a lot of the things that we heard was that we're all fed up of experts. I don't think we're fed up of experts at all. I think we have a lack of really good quality independent experts, and that's what the academy, that's what academia should be doing. And we are under pressure in the academy to have impact, to show that our work is actually socially relevant. So we're the ones perhaps superseding journalists or working alongside journalists who should be writing for the right-wing press, for the left-wing press, for the centrist press. And we don't. We really, really don't. It's incredibly scary. We don't want to take jobs away from journalists. But at the same time, we are actually taxpayer funded to do incredibly important research around any area that you want to talk about. All of the things that we've talked about today has got a massive wealth of academic research that could give us some of the crucial answers, and it's not actually getting out there because people are drowned by actual fake news, which is people Googling stuff on the internet. And we actually need to bring back some more respect, I think, for academics, particularly independent academics, in all of these fields.
Kathleen, do you want to add on to that?
Yes, I think what Kirstein was saying about investing in journalism in order to hold power to account is really important. I think there's a problem in Scotland at the moment where, if we do hold power to account sometimes, if we do a story that's critical of the Scottish Government, it becomes SNP bad. Whereas I think that's a problem. I think you can be we are a pro-independence paper, which at the same time, can ask questions about certain policies, and if policies are failing, or if there are inadequacies in services, we can ask these questions in an honest way without them being criticised, by independent supporters as being negative about about Scotland. I think it's just a mature nation should be able to reflect on itself, and maybe not always positively. But saying that, I think the problem that we've got is that in some quarters of the media, no matter what the Scottish Government does, even if it is a positive policy, it's criticised in most starkest terms. So I think that is the wider agenda, and I can see why people then get annoyed with sometimes the powers that be being held fairly in account, because I think in some quarters they're actually being criticised unfairly.
When I was in Catalonia about 2 or 3 years ago, one of the big things I noticed there when travelling about to Barcelona and other areas was the fact that they have multiple different media outlets. They have tons of different radio stations for sure. I have plenty of different TV news stations, and if you also look at Norway as well, which is a similar population, Scotland as well, they have 6 TV channels and plenty again of radio stations. And we look at Scotland, we have 3 TV channels and what 2 or 3 big wide radio stations. So why is it these countries and regions, region, however you want to define Catalonia, how do they have such a big voice when it comes to broadcasting, but in Scotland we seem to lack that voice?
It's your area, but I'm just interested that you brought up the example of Catalonia, because that's where I've done some research, and it's very, very interesting in terms of when we look at the recent Catalonian referendum and the response by Spain, etc. It was completely differently broadcasted than, for example, the independence referendum, and that's partly because the independence referendum was held above board and Westminster accepted the result, whereas Spain has not accepted that kind of result. But it is interesting, and I remember being asked by Catalonian journalists and by lots of journalists, why on earth has Scotland voted against independence and there are no tanks in the streets? How on earth could a small nation who's got obviously a sense of identity, etc., do this kind of thing? And I think what we've seen in places like Catalonia and Basque Country and in Belgium as well, where you've got the Flanders split, is that there is much more of a kind of a national identity that pervades into the market and into the academy. So, for example, a lot of academics in Catalonia will teach in Catalan and will be teaching journalists and will be teaching students who then become journalists. So there is that kind of sense, much more ingrained sense of a proud tradition of sovereignty and identity that actually builds up particularly young people who are entering journalism.
So are you saying that would feed into the area of journalism and broadcasting?
I think it does, because I think journalism, particularly in those areas, but also in the area of Norway, etc., it reflects, I mean, we know that it can shape national opinion, but it does really reflect national opinion and national values. And when you've got people who are entering into the field who are actually willing to engage in different kinds of debate, quite robust debate, and actually willing to hold lots of different opinions in their head at the same time, it's interesting, going back to what we were talking about previously. Both of these areas have proportional representation. They have a political system that is used to complexity, that doesn't deal with black and white issues and you're here or you're there. And I think if we grew as a nation in Scotland and could encompass and embrace that complexity, we would actually see much more complexity in our media, in our economy, and in our parliamentarians as well. We're still very tied to this kind of historic UK system where you're either left or you're right, you're black or you're white. And actually the reality is that the world is now much more complex than that, and I think Scotland and the UK generally just hasn't caught up with that.
There's also, maybe you can make the argument as well, that whilst maybe a national identity needs to be put into a media, I mean that would be heavily debated of course on what national identity is, but there's also the argument as well that for areas like Catalonia, for example, broadcasting is devolved.
Yes.
Is that a factor you'd argue is important to why they have such a big voice?
Yes, I would say so. I'm not an expert on
just not in Catalonia in general, but just
but the fact that they've got, it's a devolved power and they've got so many TV stations, I think is not a coincidence. And I know that during the Smith Commission, the SNP were calling for broadcasting to be devolved. It's a Scottish Parliament that was obviously refused. But
it wasn't just the SNP. It's interesting about the
yes,
Smith Commission.
yes.
I was doing lots of work
Yes.
and research on the ground with people because there was an awful lot. You know, they took 14,000 submissions from various organisations, and I was involved in some of the research of that.
Yes, yeah.
There was also a groundswell opinion from the electorate that actually broadcasting is one of the main areas that should be devolved to Scotland.
Yes.
People wanted to see a more Scotland-focused broadcasting. Both pro-independence and anti-independence, both left and right, were all saying that. This was one of the raft of powers that people wanted to see. And actually, you know, in the independence referendum, if Devo Max had been on the paper, 70% would have voted for it. And people all interpreted that as including things like broadcasting. And that hasn't happened doesn't actually reflect what people wanted to happen and still think probably should happen.
So, you know, you make the point that there's mass opinion to, you know, devolve broadcasting to Scotland, and it was backed by the biggest party, and it's also backed by the Greens too. So why hasn't it happened then?
Well, there's going back, we've said this a lot, you know, in terms of who's in power in Westminster and what Westminster is concerned with, because Scotland can only go so far in terms of devolution and devolved powers as Westminster lets it. Westminster is very centralising. Westminster is very much coming back to the media, and it very much wants its power centralised there. It sees itself as being in charge of the Union and being in charge of the UK, and we see it in the Brexit debates. All the powers need to come back to Westminster because it's Westminster that is in the right place to decide. It actually doesn't trust its own people. It doesn't trust, and we see this in Wales as well. There was a huge battle to try and get Welsh language broadcasting up and running. It doesn't trust the devolution. It doesn't trust the outskirts of its own nation to actually look after itself, because it suspects, I think, that when it started looking after itself, those would grow counter to the centralising influence and the centralising power that Westminster wants.
Yes, I would come in on that. I think there's probably refused, maybe because they thought that if it was devolved to Scotland, it would actually create a more sort of pro-independence climate by perhaps reinforcing Scottish culture. There've been more programmes, maybe more documentaries about Scotland and Scottish industry, economy, oil, renewables, and this may actually foster a sort of pro-independence, you know, narrative in the end. So perhaps that's why. Obviously it came the independence referendum, you know, didn't, and it got to 45%, but I was pretty close. They didn't expect that.
They didn't.
They probably expected maybe it would get up to maybe 25%. Nobody would vote for, or very few people would vote for independence. But the fact that it went up to 45%, I think, was a real shock for the UK government, and probably didn't want to put something in the mix that would actually bring an independence vote even closer.
If you look comparatively at other areas, like Catalonia, like Flanders, like where there is a strong devolution and there could be a strong push towards independence. There isn't a strong push towards independence, for example, in Flanders, because they have actually devolved basically everything that could possibly be devolved. So everything that people want, short of actually breaking free of the union or breaking free from the country, has actually been given to them.
Yes.
And actually that quells the independence debate. That takes the independence debate back to the hardcore of 20% who'd want it no matter what. That would actually ameliorate the central ground, and they'd all say, actually that's fine. That is fine. That's the level of powers I want Scotland to have. I don't really want to leave the UK. And all of the academic research backs this up. The way in which people voted was they wanted more powers in Scotland, but they didn't want to leave the UK.
I think that's really interesting. I think it comes back to this whole power grab debate that we were talking about earlier, and whereas maybe to some people it seems quite technical, it fits into it's probably a mistake for the UK government to be pushing this agenda, because I think in the long term it will lead to increased support for independence.
It absolutely will.
All right, that was so. Everything discussed actually all comes together. This is quite interesting. There's one theme I hear quite a lot from my dad's made the point as well. People I've met who are older than me have made the point was that maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, there was a lot of great Scottish quality programmes, and they weren't just just in Scotland, but all people without Scotland said that actually the quality of programming we've seen in the broadcasting has been fantastic, and yet it has kind of slowly but surely kind of shrunk a little bit. For a classic example being Taggart. Very popular. It was very popular outside of Scotland as well. You can name it a dozen different shows. So again, is the shrinkage of the kind of broadcasting linked into cuts? Is it linked into the general, theme of a slowly shrinking mainstream media?
I honestly don't know.
Yes, yeah.
I honestly don't know.
That was more of a personal question, but that's like quality journalism used to be great, and now broadcasting is now shrinking. But okay. But
I don't know, but I would suspect if there aren't as many resources as there were, 20 years ago, then we're not going to be able to make cutting edge dramas like Cat Tigers.
I guess what I'm secretly saying is bring back Taggart.
Yeah.
I think you are. But I think there are other broadcasts. I mean, Netflix is where you now see the cutting edge dramas.
Mm-hmm.
That is where everybody goes for what's
Yes.
current, what's really edgy, and it's and it's market driven, and so it
Yes.
shouldn't be really edgy. It should be, but it does actually do that. We can see more Scottish programmes on Netflix. That might actually fulfil your.
I would move away from my studies and fail my exams if that was the case. But I mean,
But it's a huge issue, not only culturally and in terms of how people are informed and if they think about Scotland, but actually in terms of the economy as well.
Yes.
It has a potential to be a very buoyant sector, which where thousands and thousands of people are employed, and I think there should be more to be more perhaps to be done by the Scottish Parliament to try, or Scottish Government to try and boost this sector.
well, I mean, before we end today's show, it's worth pointing out actually that there was a Robert the Bruce movie coming to Netflix fairly soon, and we also have Outlander as well. So perhaps this is the start of maybe a good rise in actually more Scottish programmes on a worldwide service like Netflix.
Yeah, well, definitely. I take Outlander. I mean, it has actually helped to increase tourism as well in Scotland.
Absolutely.
With,
And also the
Outlander
arts.
tours.
Yeah.
The arts and the
popular.
creative sector is the one sector that we know is going to, and looking after old people, the one sector we know is going to continue to boom and
Yes.
continue to grow. And it absolutely, we've got fantastic writers, producers, actors in Scotland, and it absolutely should be a focus of economic development.
Well, first of all, Kathleen, Kirsten, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for tuning in if you've been watching. Before we go, we just want to say, if you like what you've seen here today, a great guest for the future as well to come, and a great guest you've seen today and in the past, why not support us? Why not, if you want to go to our YouTube channel, subscribe. But if you want to see more quality journalism and more quality broadcasting such as this, why not even go away and subscribe? And if you subscribe, give suggestions. What do you want to see in the future? But that's all it is for today. Thank you very much. I'm Cameron Archibald, and you've watched The Full Scottish. Have a nice day.